The British preferred setting up island colonies. It fit their worldview as an island nation, and they were much easier to defend. The British Navy would always be there to defend British interests, at least for now. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British lost interest in Southeast Asia. They had their hands full everywhere. Following Napoleon's defeat, British interests reignited. These interests were helped along by Sir Stamford Raffles. He was born at sea in 1783, and his father abandoned him and his mother at a very early age. Stamford, born Thomas, had to drop out of school to support his family. He was an extremely devoted son and a passionate human being. To state the opinion of John Curtis Perry, he was, quote, feverishly ambitious, highly purposeful, enthusiastic, and independent. Raffles displayed that criterion of leadership that is having the courage to challenge authority, unquote. He began ignominiously as a clerk at the headquarters of the British East India Company. In 1805, he was placed in charge of the island colony in Penang. Not being of high society, Raffles was continually ostracized by his counterparts for his lack of decorum. This only increased the zeal with which Raffles went about his short life. The colony at Penang was out of the way, far off course for sailing vessels making the run through the straits to China or India. They needed something closer to the main causeways. First, they captured Malacca from the Dutch in 1795. This conflict was part of the larger French Revolution. During the ceremony handing over power, a controversy arose. Britain claims that the acting Dutch governor granted independence to the Sultan of Johor and the surrounding islands. The Dutch claim nothing of the sort happened. What truly happened remains unclear. What we know is that the same Dutch governor had impressed upon his government the need to settle a Dutch colony on Singapore Island. This controversy would nearly lead to a war in 1819, when the impetuous Stamford Raffles first set down roots in Singapore. When Stamford arrived in Singapore, there were supposedly only 30 people inhabiting the whole island. Stamford Raffles was a highly educated and adroit man. He taught himself French and Malay. It is said that upon arriving he spoke better Malay than many of the so-called interpreters the British employed. This garnered him many local supporters. This was not another Briton who looked down his nose at the people he managed. Additionally, Raffles was a published historian, writing a comprehensive history of the island of Java in 1817, all while en route to be knighted. Throughout this work, there are not so subtle jabs at the colonial Dutch government. Raffles despised the Dutch and felt no qualms about speaking on his disdain. He and his wife spent weeks campaigning for the Singapore colony, and in 1819 they were finally granted the right to build a trading post on Singapore's main island. In true British fashion, they interpreted this as a grant of territorial sovereignty. There were protests and grumblings from the Dutch, but the Dutch Empire, once mighty and rich, was now weak. Their ability to threaten vast areas of the globe from their bases in Holland and Zealand had long disappeared. They considered military action against this new British presence, but decided against it. Instead, a so-called paper war was waged between the bureaucracies of the two countries. Raffles referred to the Dutch as, quote, preposterously wicked enemies, solely attentive to their own commercial interests, unquote. He goes on to say, quote, their intercourse with these regions invariably adhered to a more cold-blooded, illiberal, and ungenerous policy than has ever been exhibited toward any country, unless we accept the conduct of European nations toward the slave coast of Africa, unquote. Raffles was truly a man ahead of most in his time. He believed in emancipation, low taxes, and freedom of movement and religion. The paper war would continue unabated for years, until the Treaty of London in 1824 finally settled the matter. Britain granted the islands south of the Malacca Strait to the Dutch. while the Dutch gave up any right to Singapore and Malaysia. In a strange twist on their usual relationship, the island-oriented British now controlled the mainland, while the continental Dutch controlled the vast island chains. When it first came into being, Singapore experienced severe trauma and culture shock. Commerce was seized by the locals. When Raffles complained to the local Temenggong, the Malay said he and his ancestors had been pirates. There was no dishonor in taxing the sea lanes this way. For all his protesting, Raffles should have remembered his history. His homeland sea dogs had caused mayhem for commerce across the globe. Regardless, Singapore was open for business, and there would be complete freedom of trade, movement, and religion. The settlement's novelty and open doors attracted suitors the world over. Those traveling from Africa or India headed east invariably passed right by Singapore. The settlement grew as thousands of immigrant Chinese laborers arrived from the Fujian and Canton regions, and Tamil and Gujarati Indians arrived from the west. Europeans arrived from the south, risking the journey through the Cape of Good Hope, and from the north, Malays came in droves seeking work as manual laborers. The fact that this settlement enjoyed a history as the center of a vast, global trade network helped immensely. The monsoon winds favored Singapore. The Chinese junks and Malayan praus sailed once more for Singapore. Newly added to the mix were the frigates and man-o'-wars from Northern Europe. On his return trip to England, a fire broke out on Raffles' ship. John Curtis Perry says it destroyed, quote, 122 crates of books, objects, specimens, manuscripts representing years of work, unquote. This catastrophe was nothing compared to the last 3 years. His first wife and 3 of his 4 children had died, victims of tropical diseases for which the Europeans were not prepared. Raffles was also in poor health. He had blinding headaches which rendered him useless for hours on end. Had he lived in modern times, Raffles probably would have been diagnosed with a massive brain tumor. On July 5th, 1826, Raffles was dead. His body was discovered on the bottom of a flight of stairs. He was 45 years old. Before his passing, Raffles left his mark. He understood the colony was lacking in raw resources, and food would need to be imported en masse. He also recognized that people would be his main asset. With this in mind, he meticulously laid out the original design for the settlement of Singapore. He understood that the Chinese inhabitants, under British command, could be an incredibly useful tool for money-making. These same Chinese inhabitants never forgot their connection to their homeland, and these contacts proved invaluable for up-and-coming traders who quickly found themselves as rich as their British counterparts. In time, these peoples would become the modern Peranakan culture, which is composed of people from South China and archipelagic Malay. The same went for the Indian inhabitants of Singapore, who plied their trade with stunning efficiency. The native Malays, unfortunately, found themselves on the outside looking in. Their culture had no tradition of commercial pursuits, and the stunningly fast-paced nature of modern port life likely gave many of them pause. They were used to a much slower-paced life. This different perspective led to racist stereotypes about Malay peoples, which are still prevalent in Singapore today. Arabic peoples were also present on the island, and in time, they came to control almost 50% of the land in Singapore, until their decline in the 20th century. Singapore also boasted Javanese, Bengali, and Bugis workers and seamen. It was truly a melting pot, with diversity and uniqueness everywhere, depending on where you were.